Hello everyone, and welcome to my deep dive on Starfield. I'm your host, Colors Fade. Since its launch, a lot of people have talked about Starfield's deficiencies. I've seen a number of videos on YouTube where people have gone to great lengths to catalog all the problems with the game. I myself have logged over 200 hours playing Starfield, and like many others, I've come to the conclusion that it is the most flawed game Bethesda has ever made. And yes, I'm including Fallout 76 in that assessment. Recently, I've heard a number of different people blame Starfield's problems on its use of procedural generation. I'm here to tell you that is not the issue. I believe Starfield's core problems lie elsewhere. A lot of folks have suggested that if Bethesda had simply reduced the number of explorable planets from 1,000 to something much smaller, like say 5, then the game would have been better. But I do not agree with this assessment because I believe that even if they would have done that, all of the core problems would have remained. To prove that point, I'm going to spend the rest of this video analyzing the real issues with Starfield. We're going to take a look at the specific problems, their root causes, and what could have been done differently to produce a better outcome. But before we get started, and everyone rushes to the comments to criticize me as just another Starfield hater, let me point out that I have been playing and loving Bethesda's games since the beginning. From Daggerfall, Morrowind, and Oblivion, to Skyrim, Fallout 3, and Fallout 4. I can confidently say that not only have I poured more hours into Bethesda's games than all the other games I've ever owned combined, but they have also been my favorite games to play. So to be clear, I am Bethesda's target audience. Moreover, I really wanted to like Starfield. I wanted it to be good. So when I say that Starfield isn't a very good game, it's not hate, it's disappointment. And that disappointment is rooted in some very clear and objective facts. The first issue we're going to look at is the one that permeates nearly every aspect of the game, and that is the writing. Now, when I talk about writing, I want to be clear that I mean this in a broader context than most people think. I don't know who needs to hear this, but writing in a video game is more than generating dialogue. Writing, at its core, is the creative process of inventing something from nothing. All the things you encounter in a video game, the world building, the lore, the factions, the characters, the systems, the quest design, and yes, the dialogue, all come out of the creative process of writing. And unfortunately, this is Starfield's weakest point, a weakness that negatively affects nearly every other aspect of the game. Case in point, the Starborn Powers that players acquire. This is one of the most heavily criticized portions of the game, labeled as repetitive and boring even from players who really like Starfield. And yet, someone had to invent this process from nothing. Someone had to more or less write it down and describe how it works. This process of talking to an NPC to obtain a quest that marks a location to a temple, then fast traveling to that star system, then fast traveling again to the planet, then walking to the temple without anything interesting interrupting the journey, and then floating around a zero-G room until the player bumps into 5 floating star clusters while the music crescendos, and then exiting the temple and fighting a lone starborn enemy. This entire process was conceived and written by people on Bethesda's team, and this was the least creative way they could have gone about it. As many other critics have mentioned, Skyrim had a similar mechanic with its dragon shouts, but acquiring those powers always involved either a long and entertaining dungeon crawl or a threatening boss enemy guarding a word wall. In both cases, the process of acquiring a new dragon shout was anything but boring. The Starborn Powers might be the best example of the weak writing affecting Starfield's gameplay, but make no mistake, weak writing permeates this game at every level. One of the prime ways it manifests is through the quests. A great example of this is when the player is first introduced to the Freestar Rangers. We arrive at a keyless city during a hostage crisis involving the local Galbank, and immediately we're asked to intervene and play the role of hostage negotiator. Now, on its face, this is absurd. There's no other way to put it. In real life, hostage negotiation is a very delicate situation that requires, at the very least, specialized training. Asking a complete stranger to perform this role defies all logic, even for a video game. It's a gross insult to the player's intelligence that this quest is written this way. But not only that, it's also immersion breaking. Part of what differentiates good writing from bad writing is how much work the player has to do to suspend their disbelief. If we have to work really hard to suspend our disbelief, if we have to basically shut off our brains in order to buy the story being presented to us, then that writing is not good. The sad thing is there were plenty of other more believable ways for this scene to play out so that the player still winds up in the bank, guns blazing, taking out the criminals. The writers could have started by putting the sheriff fully in charge of the situation, instead of having him stand back like a bystander and say, essentially, "There's nothing I can do, so why don't you try, stranger?" After all, he's the person who actually should have authority in this situation, so why isn't he taking charge? The answer is, of course, bad writing. The thing is, the writers already had everything they needed for this moment to play out in a more believable and immersive way. Sam, a former Freestar Ranger, is a mandatory companion at this point in the game. His familiarity with the sheriff and the Freestar Rangers should have been used as a bridge between the sheriff and the player. At that point, the sheriff could have said, "I've tried negotiating with them, but I can tell they're not coming out without a fight." We could have believed that A, the sheriff was in charge of the situation from the start, and B, he's exhausted all diplomatic options. It's time for action. Then the sheriff could have asked Sam, "Are you willing to risk your life one more time for the Freestar Rangers?" At which point Sam could have turned to the player and asked the same question. This solution still isn't entirely believable, but no solution ever could be. Involving a complete stranger in an important hostage negotiation situation could never be totally realistic, but that's not the point. The point is to reduce the amount of work the player has to do to suspend their disbelief. Changing this scene would have been a huge improvement over the way it actually plays out, and that's the important point I want to stress. The difference between bad, mediocre, and great writing is often just a matter of a few degrees. That's why we have editors. With Starfield, Bethesda doesn't seem to want to make the effort to push their quests from bad or mediocre and into the realm of good or great. If there was ever a game where it felt like Bethesda was just mailing it in, it's Starfield. This sort of illogical quest design rears its ugly head over and over throughout the game. One of the most egregious examples occurs on Neon when the player encounters the Ebside Strikers gang. This quest alone is probably one of the most poorly written quests I've ever encountered in a video game. It starts by talking to a member of the Strikers gang while in Madame Sauvage's place, and it's clear from the outset that the power dynamic between the Strikers and Madame Sauvage is completely backward of how any competent writer would have handled it. Instead of the Strikers taking over the bar and pushing Madame Sauvage around, the bar owner herself, for reasons we cannot fathom, has all the power. She easily shuts down the Strikers during the initial conversation with the player, chastising the gang member you're speaking to like a mother scolding a small child. It makes us wonder why Madame Sauvage hasn't kicked the Strikers out of her place already, if she can browbeat them like this. And yet, the leader of the Strikers has his own personal office on the upper floor. It literally makes no sense. As the quest progresses, we learn that the Strikers are down on their luck because the other gang in town, the Disciples, is a ruthless, bloodthirsty band of hardcore thugs who basically squeeze the Strikers out of business. The flaw here is that we're only ever told this fact. It's never shown to us. This is a huge problem, and it's directly because of writing. The player can walk around Neon for days and never see hide nor hair of the Disciples. At no time do we ever see them shaking down a merchant in a back alley or holding someone hostage at gunpoint. We never see them killing anyone or engaging in a shootout with the Neon police. We never actually see the presence of the Disciples at all. Contrast this with Night City in Cyberpunk 2077. That city is teeming with visual examples of the crime that infests it. Journeying through Night City, the player can easily spot a holdup or see gangs shooting it out with the police. We don't need to be told that Night City is a crime-infested metropolis. We can see it with our own eyes every step of the way. In writing, this contrast is known as showing versus telling, and in the vast majority of cases, showing is always better. Telling has its uses, mainly as a tool for increasing pace, but in a game like Starfield, there's no advantage to telling. It just comes off as bad writing. Back on Neon, there's no visual evidence that the Disciples are anything but a myth. When we finally do progress the quest far enough to take them out, what do we find? Just a bunch of NPCs standing around. They're not actually engaging in any criminal activity at all. If it weren't for the quest marker guiding us to them, we could easily mistake them for dock workers on a smoke break. Why are we killing them again? There are many more quests afflicted by this kind of careless, illogical, uninspired, and immersion-breaking writing, but before I move on, I want to cover one more example that is so egregious, I think it perfectly highlights everything wrong with the writing in Starfield, and that is the First Contact quest. This quest begins innocently enough when the authorities at Paradiso contact the player, asking for help with a large ship of unknown origin currently orbiting their planet. As it turns out, this is a colony ship from Earth, one that departed our solar system centuries ago, before grav drives were invented. It has taken them a couple hundred years to travel the distance to Paradiso, and now the crew of the ship, the ancestors of the original crew, find themselves in the unenviable position of wanting to colonize a planet that is already inhabited. As quest setups go, this is kind of cool, and I was immediately drawn in, but then Bethesda's bad writing rears its head once more. The entire conceit here is that the colonists and the people of Paradiso can't share the planet. It's a false drama manufactured for no other reason than so this quest can exist, because without this illogical constraint there is no problem and hence no quest. At its most basic level, this situation makes absolutely no sense. It makes even less sense within the context of Starfield's universe, because neither New Atlantis, Aquila City, or Neon are big cities. They're dots on the maps of their respective worlds. They occupy tiny specks of real estate. The writers at Bethesda are asking us to believe that the colonists of this ship can't simply set down on the other side of the planet, away from the Paradiso resort, and establish their colony there. Do they think we're brain dead? This illogical false drama is something that crops up over and over in Starfield. It is peak bad writing that asks us, the player, to simply shut off our brains, to be happy with nonsensical quest design and idiotic quest resolutions, because hey, the game is giving us something to do. It is an insult to the intelligence of every single person who forked over money to play this game. I reiterate again though, it's impossible to suspend one's disbelief and immerse oneself in a role-playing game when the writing insults the player's intelligence this severely. And yet, that's exactly what Starfield does time and time again. It's not just the quests that are poorly written though. The companions in Starfield are also terrible and represent one of the worst missteps in Bethesda's storied history. The biggest problem here is that all of them share the exact same moral compass. If the player wants to do anything questionable or against the law, every single companion will disapprove. This monolithic morality shared among all the companions means that if the player wants to have the approval of their fellow adventurers, there is only one acceptable way to play the game. This situation is so absurd that it quickly became a meme after the game's launch. Everyone hated that, and for good reason. It's shockingly bad game design. And it makes it feel like the developers don't care about either the companions or the player. As if having the same morality among all the companions wasn't problematic enough, they are also hollow, underdeveloped shells of real people. Their personal quests, when present, are threadbare and uninspiring, with unsatisfying and rushed conclusions. And forget romancing the ladies. Both Andreja and Sarah have the icy personalities of a winter witch, which begs the question, who exactly was responsible for writing these romances? Apparently, the writers at Bethesda are unaware of how attraction and romance actually work. The biggest turn-on is when the other person shows interest in you. Without mutual attraction, there can be no romance. When it's a one-way street, that's not called romance, that's called stalking. No one who isn't a sociopath or a stalker wants to romantically pursue a person who doesn't want to be pursued. Both Andreja and Sarah make it abundantly clear, early and often, that they aren't interested in romance. They're all business. They're here to explore the galaxy and uncover the artifacts. So why is the option to romance them even there? What kind of message are we sending to the people who play this game? We just collectively, as a society, experienced a huge Me Too movement a few years back. Wasn't the whole point to let men know that no means no? That power dynamics shouldn't be used as leverage to engage in unwanted sexual advances? That men shouldn't try pursuing women who have no desire to be pursued? And yet, here's Bethesda giving us two female characters who clearly don't want to be romanced, and then providing a bunch of really uncomfortable dialogue options to that effect. It's disturbing at the very least, and moronically tone deaf at the worst. The whole point of writing a character that the player can romance is to make that character someone who is not only attractive, but also someone who wants to reciprocate the player's feelings. Romance is not a one-way street. It's supposed to be a dance between two willing partners. The companions should not be written like slot machines, where the player simply has to poke enough dialogue options in before their chosen love interest puts out. At the most basic level, this is just bad writing, but it's also really bad messaging. It's an incomplete understanding of attraction and a gross misunderstanding of how people interact when they are romantically interested in each other. It's a massive failure on Bethesda's part and something that I hope other game developers learn from going forward, because this is not how you write romance, folks. As if the romances weren't bad enough, there's also Cora. She's Sam's daughter, and Sam lets us know right away that wherever he goes, she goes. Now, I don't know about you, but the idea of bringing a child aboard a spaceship where armed conflict is the order of the day seems like a really bad idea. Every time pirates started shooting at my ship, I kept thinking, I'm sorry your dad is so irresponsible, Cora. You should be planetside, somewhere safe. Of course, as long as that somewhere safe is in America, where gun violence routinely kills people every day, but I digress. Even if you can get past Sam's incredibly awful parenting choice, there's still more bad writing at work. Cora says early on that she's an avid reader and would love a copy of a specific book, and there are plenty of books all over Starfield. I, like a lot of other players, picked these books up with gusto every chance I got, anticipating that I would eventually give them to Cora. But nope, you can't. It's writing like this that makes Starfield infuriating to play. If it happened once or twice, sure, we could all live with it, but this sort of thing is everywhere. I could go on for days citing example after example of the bad writing in Starfield. In the quests, in the companions, in the dialogue. But that's not the point. The point is this. Even if Bethesda would have not used procedural generation, all of this bad writing would remain. When it comes to interacting with the characters of this galaxy, the combination of Bethesda's dated presentation model along with the abysmal writing effort of the quest, it makes everything a struggle to enjoy. So from a writing perspective, procedural generation was never the problem, and I would argue that most of Starfield's major issues stem in one way or another from the deficiencies in the writing. But what about the other parts of the game? Two other areas I want to touch on briefly are the user interface and the skill system. The vast majority of players and critics have remarked at how awful the user interface is. I don't think I need to cover this ground. It is one of the worst user interface experiences I've ever encountered. But the UI is actually one of the few things that modders can improve, and they have. UI mods were the first thing to hit the internet after Starfield launched, coming out mere days after its release. The skill system, on the other hand, will probably take more time for modders to overhaul, but eventually, like Skyrim, I suspect they will, because it's awful. At its core, the skill system is a combination of the Elder Scrolls' Use It to Get Better system and Fallout 4's more direct perk selection system. When I first saw this, I thought, great, best of both worlds. And maybe that's what Bethesda's developers were thinking too. Unfortunately, the way it's implemented, this is the worst of both worlds. By now, everyone knows how this system works. The player has to select a skill, just like selecting perks in Fallout 4, but then they have to complete a challenge before they can level up the skill any further. This becomes the use it to get better portion of the equation, which unfortunately doesn't actually help the player get better. Instead, it serves more as a frustrating gatekeeping mechanism. But that's actually not the worst part of it. There are 4 tiers to each skill, and in order to elect a skill further down the list, one that the player might actually want, they must first put a certain number of points into that particular tree. This has the awful effect of forcing players to spend points in skills they don't want in order to reach the skills they actually desire. On top of that, the added layer of challenges makes the process far slower and more frustrating than it needs to be. It's literally the worst system Bethesda has ever made. That said, these features, the user interface and the skill system, are not affected by the procedural generation either. So again, to reiterate the point we made at the start of the video, if Bethesda had not used procedural generation for its worlds, these problems would still exist. Which brings us to the final part I want to discuss, and that is the exploration. Aha, you say. This is where procedural generation sucks. In the immortal words of Lee Corso, Not so fast. Procedural generation is an incredibly useful tool for generating large swaths of landscape, but landscape alone doesn't make a game. It's what the developer does with that landscape that matters, and this is where Starfield fails dramatically. Consider games like Fallout 4 and Skyrim. Skyrim, with its DLC, has over 450 unique locations the player can visit. Fallout 4, with its DLC, has 510. Not a single one of these locations is a duplicate of another. They are all unique. But that is not the case with Starfield. Play Starfield for even a little while, and it won't take long to realize that most of the points of interest on any given planet are actually recycled locations. The cave that the player finds Andrasia in, for instance, is used over and over throughout the game for all sorts of other random missions. The same goes for all the other science outposts and crash sites. They're just the same dungeon asset recycled again and again, right down to the loot being placed in exactly the same spots. You can blame this on procedural generation, but that's not really the problem. The problem is how few unique dungeons Bethesda created to populate their game. There was nothing stopping them from making 450 or 510 unique locations like they did with Skyrim and Fallout 4, and then randomly scattering those locations across their 1,000 procedurally generated worlds. Even with some reuse, the sheer volume of that many locations would have made the repetition much less noticeable, if noticeable at all. But Bethesda didn't do that. Instead, they opted for a half dozen dungeons that get recycled over and over. And it's that obvious recycling of content that quickly grows stale. I've heard some people make the argument that they would have preferred it if Starfield had been confined to a much smaller number of planets, like say 5. But the problem with that idea is that planets are huge. They still have to develop enough content, enough locations for the player to visit. Content density quickly becomes a problem when you're talking about a whole planet. In games like Fallout 4 and Skyrim, the maps are actually not that big. They're only a few kilometers across. But Bethesda loaded those games with hundreds of unique locations, creating a very dense collection of content for the player to discover. The end result is that the player doesn't have to travel very far to encounter new content. Planets and space, however, are gigantic. Both realms are much bigger than any of the world maps Bethesda has previously built. So even if they wanted to confine the game to 5 worlds, for example, each of those worlds still has to have enough content on it to create a satisfying exploration and discovery experience. Otherwise, without a dense amount of contact, the player is left to wander a barren landscape, spending most of their time traveling and very little of their time doing anything remotely interesting. And that, friends, does not make for compelling game content. Couple this with the fact that Bethesda clearly has an aversion to implementing vehicles, as there are no land vehicles to speak of whatsoever in Starfield, and you have a situation ripe for boredom, which is precisely how the Starborn Powers worked out. There's a lot of walking around without anything interesting happening. In short, all travel and no play makes Jack a dull boy. So the question really becomes, how do we populate a significantly large surface area, like a planet, or vast swaths of empty space, with enough content to make it interesting for the player to explore? Oddly enough, a video game has already done this. The developers at Hello Games realized these same problems early on and opted for specific solutions. First, they shrunk the playable area. Star systems in No Man's Sky are so small that all of the planets can be seen from each of the others. Unfortunately, this solution wouldn't have worked for Starfield because it's set in our real-life galaxy, and the planets are too far apart to be seen with the naked eye. So unless Bethesda wanted to hedge the truth a bit, this wouldn't have worked. Still, it's educational to note that this was part of the solution for No Man's Sky. The next thing Hello Games did was implement mechanisms that allow the player to traverse vast distances very quickly. In space, the player can engage a pulse drive to speed traversal from planet to planet. It literally never takes longer than 2 minutes to get from one planet to another. And on land, the player can build vehicles that make ground traversal much faster than walking. Finally, among all these procedurally generated planets, they populated them with an abundance of wildlife, caves, resources, and locations. Now, to be fair, No Man's Sky probably doesn't have any greater number of unique locations than Starfield does. But there's one more thing that Hello Games did that helped make its game feel more like adventuring in space. And that thing basically became the magic sauce that became the success of No Man's Sky. I'm talking about seamless traversal. In No Man's Sky, a player can board their ship, launch into the air, fly through the atmosphere, and pilot their ship into outer space. They can then fly through the solar system while passing by other ships, space stations, asteroid fields, and fleets of huge freighters. From there, they can fly to another planet where they can seamlessly penetrate the atmosphere, fly over the landscape, and eventually touch down literally anywhere they please. Once on the ground, the player can walk wherever they desire, and if they decide to build a base, they can use a number of land vehicles to traverse the planet even faster. It's only when the player wants to travel to a completely different solar system that they actually have to deal with a loading screen. And Hello Games smartly masks this with a warp animation. Compare this to Starfield, where boarding the ship requires a loading screen. Taking off is another loading screen masked by a cutscene. And then the player arrives in space at exactly the same position on every planet. There's a 5-kilometer bubble in the orbit above every planet where all the space action takes place. If the player wants to fly to another planet in the same system, they must once again choose fast travel. Warping to another system requires a cutscene, as does landing on a planet. And then there's another loading screen to disembark the ship. Docking and undocking from space stations requires a cutscene, but stupidly this doesn't mask the loading process. I don't think I need to say that fast travel is the least immersive method possible for a game set in outer space. I'm sure someone is going to counter by saying the technology in No Man's Sky is difficult to implement or some nonsense like that. But keep in mind, No Man's Sky launched 9 years before Starfield hit the market. Bethesda is a AAA studio with a lot of money and smart developers. They had all that time to research, develop, and implement the same sort of seamless travel technology, and they chose not to. The problem with Bethesda's over-reliance on fast travel is that it kills exploration. It basically eliminates the potential for the player to discover encounters by accident. This was really the best part of games like Skyrim and Fallout 4. Each of those games begins with a narratively driven directive. They start out as quest-based games guiding the player to new locations. However, it isn't long before the player encounters unexpected content along the way. Bethesda's games have always employed fast travel, and yet none of them have failed to feel satisfying from an exploration perspective. The reason is because while fast travel exists, Bethesda has always wisely put a very specific constraint on its usage. In every game before Starfield, if a player wanted to fast travel to any location, they first had to physically go there. After the initial visit then, and only then, could the player use fast travel to get back to that location. This limitation forced players to traverse the map at least once, and it was on that journey that they would discover all of the game's additional content. Limiting fast travel actually fostered exploration and discovery because it forced players to traverse the map. Knowing that players were going to have to traverse these maps, the developers were able to populate them with all manner of unique content. In Skyrim, there were loads of dungeons, bandit forts, word walls, and even dragons lurking on the side of the road. In Fallout, it was commonplace to encounter wandering bands of robots or raiders, or find the Brotherhood of Steel locked in a firefight with supermutants. Creep around the city center of Boston and you could find raiders hiding out between alleys with boarded up doors, or hear the sounds of gunfire in the distance. These worlds were smartly crafted to feel alive and lived in, and the player was encouraged to encounter all of this content by actually traveling across these maps with very few loading screens. Starfield, on the other hand, suffers from the fact that it's set in space. And because it is, and more importantly because Bethesda decided not to implement a seamless travel system like No Man's Sky, all of those accidental moments of exploration and discovery were lost because there is no seamless travel mechanism. To make up for this, Bethesda has utilized its quest system more frequently, having the player overhear dialogue from NPCs or be told things by the guards that then trigger an entry in the quest journal. In a way, this makes the cities more desirable to visit because the quest triggers work as a way to hand the player new content. But it's hard to argue that this is more fun because there's no real exploration or discovery going on. The player might as well just walk up to a computer terminal and say, "Give me more quests." Oh, wait, you can actually do that. This sort of auto-feeder quest dispenser wouldn't be so bad if the quests in Starfield were worth a damn. But as I said in the first half of this video, the writing is so poor that very few quests in this game are actually fun or exciting to do. And as it turns out, most of the automated quests you can get from the passerby, NPCs, guards, or quest kiosks are actually incredibly uninspiring and simplistic. After 200 hours playing, I'm still have yet to find a secondary quest that is actually worth doing. The reality is, Starfield could have been an awesome space game had it opted for a seamless travel experience like No Man's Sky. Had Bethesda done that, then every single solar system could have been a map for players to explore in their ships, with all manner of interesting and random events scattered across the system. Just as we encounter random bands of super mutants locked in battle with the Brotherhood of Steel, we could have found the UC in a huge battle against the Crimson Fleet. And just like Fallout 4 with the proper distance, we could decide if we wanted to fly around that danger or join the party. Flying through a solar system from one planet to the next with some kind of advanced pulse drive like No Man's Sky could have allowed the player to discover all sorts of content. Imagine if the player equipped their craft with advanced sensors and then suddenly they're seeing more of the content than before. Ships adrift in the dark that players might dock with and scour for salvage. Or smugglers hiding in the shadows of an asteroid field where they're closing a deal with a crime lord on some contraband. How about smuggler kings making their home on remote worlds or derelict asteroid stations? Places that don't show up on any regulated system map and can only be found by actually exploring space and using a scanner. Or what about playing as an actual bounty hunter, having to fly around the cosmos, picking up the trail of your quarry, landing on planets, talking to people in bars, buying off contacts, asking other NPCs if they've seen this person, or if they know of any good locations where someone might go to lay low and escape. There's so much Bethesda could have done with this game had they simply opted for a seamless traversal model. But they didn't. Sure, there are events in space. There's a zero-G casino overrun with enemies, and a deserted space station where something bad clearly happened. The occasional skirmish between the Freestar Rangers and the Crimson Fleet. But all of these encounters take place in exactly the same place and in exactly the same way, in that tiny 5-kilometer bubble of space directly outside of a planet's orbit, which is only ever accessible via fast travel. The player can never be at a distance where they can detect encounters and decide whether they want to fly into that danger or fly around it. Everything in space always plays out exactly the same way. Fast travel to the bubble, engage the content, rinse, repeat. It gets stale really fast, which is why Bethesda is forced to lean on its quest system so heavily. But therein lies the rub. The writing in the game is so poor that none of the quests are worth doing. Quests might be different if the rewards were any good. Players will happily engage in bad quests in exchange for great rewards. But even here the game is lacking. The skills system with its wasteful perk spending requirements and gatekeeping challenges makes leveling up a chore. Legendary weapons are easily outclassed by plain weapons with better damage ratios. And forget about modding anything to make it better. Whereas weapon and armor modding were fun and rewarding and useful in Fallout 4, in Starfield it's just another skill locked behind a bunch of resource-hungry research. It's painful. The problem is, modders can't fix it. Oh, they can fix some of it. They can fix the UI, and I suspect with time they might be able to fix the skills system too, but they can't fix the core problems. They can't fix the stuff that really matters. They can't fix the lack of seamless traversal. Someone tried, and then we all found out that you can't actually reach a planet even if you can fly to it super fast.
The resolution's terrible, clearly not designed for you to be this close, and then as I get very, very, very close to the surface, like a few meters away, you start to see the headlights of the ship show up on the planet, so it's like a big white light. Ooh. It was flat. Pluto confirmed flat! Flat Earth! We just went right through it!
Instead, you just disappointingly pass right through. Modders can't fix the 5-kilometer bubble because they can't fix fast travel, nor can they fix the recycled dungeon content with or without the procedurally generated worlds. They might eventually be able to add some unique dungeons in the far future, but it's going to take a lot of time without access to Bethesda's development tools. Most of all, the modders can't fix the bad writing. They can't fix the uninspired, illogical, and immersion-breaking quest design or the boring companions. Thanks to the game being fully voice acted, they can't fix the awful dialogue or Bethesda's dated presentation style, and they can't fix the romances. Nothing about the game that actually matters can really be fixed by modders, which leaves us with the very real and very depressing fact that Starfield is simply not a very good game. Because of the way it's designed, it will never reach its potential or promise. And that's sad, because it could have been so much more. As it stands, there are 2 games that I can think of that do parts of Starfield way better than Starfield does. I think it's clear by now that No Man's Sky does the traversal and space exploration part far better than Starfield will ever do. But also look at Outer Worlds. It's a very similar game with old school Bethesda fast travel mechanics and no space combat whatsoever. And yet, because it was developed by Obsidian, it's a much better game in terms of story, companions, and writing. If Bethesda could have combined the procedural generation, traversal, and space combat portions of No Man's Sky with the well-written companions and quests of Outer Worlds, Starfield could have been a truly great game. But it does none of those things. Instead, it's a shell of a game. It shows exactly how dated and uninspired Bethesda formula is when they don't go all in to make sure that the traversal, exploration, discovery, and writing are at their best. In conclusion, I just want to say this. Procedural generation was never Starfield's problem. It's the writing and the lack of seamless traversal. Those 2 things did more to kill Starfield than any amount of procedurally generated planets. Starfield needed more. It needed seamless travel, so the player could experience more of what it's actually like to adventure in space. And it needed way better writing, so that all the companions, NPCs, and quests were up to the standards of today's games industry. Because listen, we have games like Cyberpunk 2077 and Baldur's Gate 3 now, and they are setting very high bars for things like character models and character animations, quest design, writing, and presentation. Starfield is clearly way behind the curve now. And the thing is, removing procedural generation and limiting Starfield to 5 planets wouldn't have fixed it. If anything, it would have made Starfield's true problems even more glaring, and players would have berated Bethesda for not giving them a truly epic adventure set in space. Space is big. It's huge, but Bethesda's formula just doesn't work well with that scope. Not without adding new features to make it work, like seamless traversal. And Bethesda didn't want to do that. And that is why Starfield is not a very good game. Thank you all for watching this video. If you dig it, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing to the channel, and leave your questions and comments down below. And if you want to support the channel further, you can go to the homepage, hit the join button, and for $4.99 a month, you can get access to all the videos as they drop. You don't have to wait for the weekly releases like everybody else. I'm your host, Colors Fade, and until next time, happy gaming, everyone.